in the Greco-Roman world, what were they thinking about when they were talking about who is the greatest? And Matthew, as I said in the message, reveals that this is a question about who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. So not just the greatest now, but like who in the kingdom of heaven is going to be higher in a ranking authority, which also I think is significant that it reveals that they really believe the kingdom of heaven is coming and that Christ is bringing it to them. But for them, why are they talking about who is the greatest? I think it is a sense of vanity, but it is a sense of enculturated discussion as well, that it's people aren't shy about wanting to be rulers, authorities. Who are the great ones in the Greco-Roman world? They were the kings. They were those who were served. That's what it meant to be great. To be great was to be a king, to be close to the king. And so they're having this discussion about the kingdom of heaven. And I think that's probably some of their motives is, in enculturated ways where they're talking about what is the culture's vision of greatness. What does it mean to be great in the Greco-Roman world? With that being said, they totally know they're wrong in this discussion, right? Like Jesus asks them, they're silent. They're not proud of the conversation they're having. They are shy about it, and they don't tell Jesus what they're talking about. So I think at least the way they're having this discussion is clearly to them wrong, which is interesting because elsewhere Christ says, you know how the rulers of the Gentiles, they lord it over them, but not so among you. And so this is another instance where he says, well, this is how the culture works in this way. To be great in the culture is to lord your authority over others, but according to the kingdom of heaven, that's not how greatness works. So I think, part of it is really the culture that they're in, and they're not unique. We're in a culture that teaches us, here's the path to greatness.
Yeah.
Take it. Don't apologize for it. In our culture today, I think that's dripped into everything we see. I talked about influencers. It's dripped into all of our social media. Everything we do is this image of here's how you become great. It's probably a different answer for students and for those who are working and for those who are in the family. There's always a path toward greatness, and the culture is saying this is what you have to do to be great, and they were in a culture that was telling them the same.
You talked about how Jesus asking the question is really a way to challenge them. That the questions he asks are often challenges to us to think about something, to evaluate our lives. Why does Jesus do that? Why does he use questions as kind of a challenge?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it probably depends on the question he's asking frequently. I would say questions are disarming. They're disarming, right? Where when you're asked, if someone just came up to me and said, hey, I know you're talking about who, or came up to the disciples and said, hey, I know you're talking about who's the greatest, stop it. Or your discussion about who's the greatest, that's wrong. That's very different than leaving the ball in their court and saying, what are you talking about? Leaving them an opportunity to self-reflect. And it's oftentimes that questions are actually, in some ways, both a gentler rebuke and the harsher ultimate way of being introspective. It's harder to be defensive about questions because it calls you to reflect, and yet at the same time, there is a sense of gentleness to it where it's not an immediate address. And so I think there's been multiple times in my life where someone asks me a question, maybe about a behavior I was doing. They're calling me out for something and they say, hey, I just wonder, why were you doing that? Or when you said this, what do you mean by it? And it actually is almost, in a sense, more convicting to me than when someone just comes out and tells me, hey, this is a behavior I saw that you weren't doing well. So I think Jesus is using questions here to disarm the disciples. And in some ways, that's exactly what he does. They're left in silence, and all he needs to do is ask them a question in this passage. There's no follow-up rebuke from him besides just a corrective, here's what true greatness looks like. He doesn't linger on it. All he does is ask them a question, and they're put to silence, and he moves on.
You talked about how when it comes to greatness, both our definition of greatness and our desire for greatness are faulty. And that was true for the disciples too, which is why they needed correcting. But how do you see that playing out in the world today, that kind of faulty view?
Yeah, so many ways that our definition of greatness is faulty. And I'll talk from my own experience. I'm younger, so I think greatness means something different to me than it does to probably 40s and 50s and 60-year-olds. or even people younger than me, greatness means something different. But there's 1,000 ways where greatness is faulty in our world today. The first that comes to my mind is, I think for younger individuals, success is greatness. That to be great means that you have a well-paying and well-esteemed job. It means that you're or independent, that you don't rely on anyone else financially or in any other stage of life, and that's what it means to be great. It probably means you're attractive, that you're in shape. In our culture today, these are all images of what does it mean to be great? What does it mean to be someone that others admire? It means that you're put together in all aspects of life. You're successful in all aspects of life. And so all those things are really good things at face value. Having a good job, being healthy, all those things can be really, really good things. But when they become ways where we actually create our own caste system and say, well, if you don't eat as well as I do, or if you don't exercise like I do, or if your job is not as high paying or not as high on the ladder of esteem as mine, then clearly I'm greater. So I think those are one ways. I would say over time, especially in Christian circles, family can also often be an image of greatness, where we might look at someone else's family and say, oh, they're falling apart, or their kids are so rebellious, and my kids are put together. My kids aren't doing drugs like theirs, or my kids aren't walking away from the Lord like theirs. And obviously we never would say these things in the ways that maybe the disciples just openly talk about them, but just look at our hearts, or look at our gossip, or look at the way that we oftentimes are prone to lead conversations to positively talk about our accomplishments and our success. All images of the way greatness works its way into our culture today and into our own minds and our own hearts. I'll just say, for the student level really fast, I would say grades are a huge deal. We live in a place, especially Boulder, in the wider Boulder area, where grades are so significant to both parents and students, where there's this great pressure to be taking all AP classes, all advanced placement classes, to be the top of the class, to be in that top percentage, and to have all A's. Again, just to say good things, but grades are by definition a comparative system. Right, where there's actually, to say, like, I want to be top of the class, or I want to be top 10 in the class, that's a comparative statement. And so when we're starting to judge others on their grades, or on how much, how well they do in school, then suddenly that's one where we have a faulty definition of greatness. Even might equate that with intelligence, where we say, well, clearly I'm smarter than you because I've got A's and you've got B's, or whatever. Just see that amongst students all over the place today. So those are a couple examples I think of in our culture.